They were just 35 men, but for half a century, the US government couldn't sleep. These weren't just warriors, they were ghosts, striking without warning, vanishing into the desert. Armed with grit and ancient knowledge, the Apache defied an empire. For 50 years, America feared them more than any army. It defies belief. 35 men against the might of the United States military, and they refused to be broken. For over 50 years, the US government waged war, not against a nation or a standing army, but against scattered bands of Apache warriors who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. These weren't just fighters, they were survival incarnate, and they exposed every weakness in America's expansionist dreams. To understand why the US feared these warriors so deeply and for so long, you have to understand who they were and where they came from. The Apache weren't a monolithic tribe, but a collection of fierce bands spread across the American Southwest and northern Mexico. They didn't build cities or plant fields. They lived on the move, hunted game, and fought like shadows. Their entire culture was built around mobility, endurance, and an unshakable will to remain free. That alone made them hard to conquer. But what truly terrified the US government was their utter refusal to surrender. Not just physically, but mentally. You could capture their land, destroy their camps, even kill their families, but you could never make them submit. And among these warriors, one group stood out. 35 men who led raids, evaded capture, and struck so much fear into the hearts of soldiers and settlers that their legend outlived them. These men weren't just rebels, they were ghosts to the government. Every time the army thought they had been cornered, they vanished into the mountains. Every time a peace treaty was signed, a new attack followed. Towns were burned, supply lines were severed, settlers were ambushed. The American military, which had fought in the Civil War and conquered Mexico, was suddenly humbled by a few dozen men on horseback. Geronimo was the face most recognized, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were figures like Mangas Coloradas, Cochise, and Victorio, each a tactical genius in his own right. They didn't fight like Europeans. There were no battle lines, no horns, no surrender flags. There was only silence, motion, and sudden violence. They struck at night. They bled their enemies dry with raids, not pitched battles. And they used the land like a weapon. The US military simply wasn't prepared. Trained for traditional warfare, they were constantly outmaneuvered. Apache warriors could ride 70 miles in a day, barefoot if necessary. They could live off a handful of roots and melt into terrain so hostile it would kill an average soldier in days. They didn't need roads, they needed mountains, canyons, and time. And they had all three. Over the decades, the government spent millions trying to capture or kill these warriors. Thousands of troops were deployed. Entire regiments were stationed across Arizona and New Mexico. Forts were built. Telegraph lines were strung. But nothing seemed to work. For every Apache camp burned, another would rise. For every warrior killed, 2 more would take his place. The land belonged to them, not just physically, but spiritually. They fought with the desperation of men who knew that surrender meant annihilation. The settlers lived in constant fear. A trip to fetch water could end in blood. Wagons vanished on trade routes. Ranches were raided, livestock stolen, and families slaughtered. But this wasn't senseless violence, it was war. A war against an invading force that had promised peace and delivered betrayal. Over and over, treaties were broken. Promises were made, then ignored. The Apache learned that trust was a weakness, so they responded the only way they knew how, by resisting. The 35 warriors became symbols of that resistance. They were hunted like animals, but never caught. Sometimes, they lived off captured supplies. Other times, they relied on old allies in the Mexican highlands. Their greatest ally, however, was the terrain. They knew every canyon, every water hole, every cliff edge that could become a trap. Soldiers got lost, horses collapsed, morale plummeted, and all the while, the Apache watched from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It wasn't just their skill that scared the military, it was their mindset. These were men raised to believe that freedom was worth more than life, that dying in battle was honorable, that surrender was worse than death. They didn't fear the US government, they pitied it. They saw its soldiers as men who followed orders blindly, who fought without knowing why. The Apache knew exactly why they fought: for land, for family, for pride, for survival. At one point, the US brought in Apache scouts. Tribal members promised safety in exchange for helping the army. It was a risky move, and it often backfired. Some scouts provided real intelligence. Others fed misinformation, leading troops into ambushes. The line between friend and enemy blurred. Trust eroded. Even white commanders admitted they were never truly sure who was loyal. It added a new layer of paranoia. You couldn't even trust your own allies. Meanwhile, the US government tried diplomacy. Treaties were signed, reservations were offered, but these weren't gifts, they were cages. The land assigned to the Apache was often barren, unlivable, and once confined, they were monitored, restricted, and stripped of their ways. So many refused. Others pretended to comply, only to break out and resume the fight. The 35 warriors didn't believe in surrender. They believed in justice. Geronimo himself escaped multiple times, each time reigniting the fear. He'd show up hundreds of miles from where he was last seen, launching a raid so brutal that towns would empty overnight. The military would send hundreds of soldiers to chase a man who carried no map, no compass, just memory and rage. And every time they thought he was finished, he returned. In truth, it wasn't just the men that terrified the US, it was the legacy. Every year these 35 warriors resisted was a year that Washington looked weak. Newspapers called it a national embarrassment. Generals lost their jobs. Presidents were pressured. And for what? A handful of warriors hiding in the desert, refusing to bow. It wasn't just a military issue, it was a political one. If the government couldn't protect settlers, how could it claim authority over the West? This fear led to extreme tactics. Apache children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools. Sacred land was desecrated. Entire bands were forcibly relocated thousands of miles away. Resistance was labeled terrorism. Warriors were branded outlaws. But it didn't break them. If anything, it strengthened their resolve. Even from prison, they plotted escape. Even in exile, they sang old war songs. The Apache spirit wasn't tied to geography. It was in their blood. Eventually, the numbers won out. The US was too big, the resources too vast. Bit by bit, the warriors were captured or killed. Geronimo surrendered for the final time in 1886. But it wasn't a clean victory. It was exhaustion. Decades of running, hiding, fighting, and losing family had taken its toll. Geronimo wasn't defeated, he was worn down. The remaining warriors were imprisoned far from home, treated like animals, then paraded like trophies. Geronimo himself was displayed at fairs and public events like a living artifact. It was meant to show the nation's triumph. Instead, it became a monument to its cruelty. Even in chains, he held his head high. He never apologized, he never begged, and in his eyes, you could still see the fire that had made 35 men haunt an empire. The irony is that the very traits the government feared, resilience, honor, loyalty, endurance, are the same ones now celebrated in American mythology. The Apache are remembered as icons of freedom. Their war wasn't madness, it was prophecy. A warning that even the greatest power can be humbled by those with nothing to lose and everything to protect. Today, their descendants carry that legacy. They remember the stories whispered around fires, the trails once taken in the dark, the battles fought without banners or fanfare. They remember that 35 men once shook the foundations of a continent, and they carry that pride in their blood. So why did the US fear them for 50 years? Because the Apache exposed the lie of conquest. They proved that control doesn't come from maps or forts. It comes from hearts that refuse to kneel. And for 50 years, the most powerful army in the world was held at bay by 35 such hearts.